Hello everybody, welcome back to another video. Today we are doing the roster breakdown for the Los Angeles Gladiators. They finished third overall last season with a somewhat lackluster performance in the playoffs, but wins in both the Kickoff Clash and Midseason tournaments last year. So very, very good season from them. Very good run from them. One of the more successful teams in the 2022 season. Just things that did not end well at the end of the day, with some departures for the team during the season that really kind of put this team in a somewhat weak position at the end of it all. Going into 2023, very, very different looking team and a very, very different looking organization at the very top. So before we get into the roster, it would be, I think, wrong of me to not talk about, of course, the elephant in the room in regards to the LA Gladiators, and that is their parent organization, The Guard, Kroenke Sports and Entertainment, of course, being the overall kind of company. But The Guard, who news broke last week, they laid off pretty much their entire staff. Players are still active. But the news and the reporting is that they are going to try to sell the team slot for the team this season. And if they can't, they're probably just going to fold and no longer exist. And, of course, that includes all of their teams with the Guard. So that means teams in Valorant, teams in CDL, the LA Guerrillas, teams in, I think, Halo and Apex. So definitely something to keep an eye on with what happens with this organization going forward. But that has an impact on what this team does going forward, right? Whether or not this team has any more signings throughout the season is going to be impacted by this decision. Most likely, we're not going to see them make any more additions unless they need to, unless they absolutely have to, unless they have a mass excess of players. But I don't really see that happening. Last year, they ended up at a point in the season where they only had 2 DPS players, and they didn't make any changes then until they had to. And so, to me, this is another kind of instance where we probably won't see any changes to this roster because of this situation, and which is awful, because I think as much as this roster is in a good position, relatively speaking, before we get into it, I will just kind of say that I do like where this roster is at in general. I don't think it's a perfect roster. I think there's definitely some areas where I would maybe add a piece, one max. So I think it's possible they could convince their ownership group, hey, we just need one signing, one player is all we need, and we can win this whole thing. Maybe they get lucky and that isn't a thing they need to do all season, and they're fine, but it's unfortunate to kind of see that happen. So we'll see what happens with the Gladiators and the Guard as the season progresses. Maybe this ownership change happens, and maybe they get bought out by somebody who has a lot more interest in seeing the team succeed. Maybe they move out of LA now that the Valiant are back. We'll see what happens there, but let's just go in now and talk about the roster itself. Let's talk about who we have on this roster. You can see it here. It's a pretty stacked roster full of Overwatch League veterans. You got Kevster and Funny Astro, the only 2 pieces returning from last season. They bring over Lastro and Dante, both of whom played with the Houston Outlaws last season. Yaki comes over from New York Excelsior. Babel comes over, who most recently was playing in Contenders with O2 Blast, but of course used to be a DPS player for the London Spitfire back in the 2020 season. Now he's a flex support player. And they have finally Kai, most recently played with the Atlanta Reign. So really interesting roster full of, like I said, Overwatch League veterans. It's a pretty exciting roster. So let's jump in and let's talk about it. I'm going to start with the DPS trio of Kevster, Yaki, and Kai, because I think it is arguably the strongest part of the roster. I think most people look at that trio as kind of the best part of this roster. 3 really big name players in Kevster, Yaki, and Kai. Kevster, MVP caliber player last season. Probably the second best DPS player all season, behind only the league MVP proper, who was just absurdly good last year. Very, very good season from Kevster last year. He definitely had some strengths and weaknesses down the stretch. There was some times like in the playoffs where he just did not look like the most comfortable player on Reaper. But all in all, a very, very good player who is also very flexible. Part of Kevster's value to this team is that he is a very flexible player. He can play your hit scan role, and he can play your flex DPS role, which is very, very good and very important because he is the backbone to this team. He is going to be the player that, generally speaking, plays most of the time. There is very little chance, I think, that he gets subbed out during this season. That's kind of what you want out of Kevster. It's possible he does, but his hero pool kind of allows him to be the secondary hit scan to Kai, or to play the prominent or primary flex DPS role alongside Kai, or if you find yourself in like a Tracer Genji meta or something like that, he can play the Genji or the Tracer, and you have Yaki who can also play the Genji or the Tracer. So this team is going to be pretty good in a lot of different metas. I think they are relatively meta-proof in DPS, which is very good. That has been my biggest criticism for both of the two rosters that I've already done so far in this offseason, Dallas and San Francisco. Neither of them, in my opinion, are meta-proof in the DPS line. This team, I think, is. They were last season, too, at the start of the season, before they lost Patifan and Ants. But with Yaki, Kevster, and Kai, they can play everything, right? Kai is going to be the primary hit scan player. He's your Widow, he's your Ashe, he's a really good Sojourn, which is really, really good. So that's a huge benefit for this team to have someone who they trust in that role. You pair that with Kevster, who can play whatever you need him to play pretty much. He can play the secondary hit scan, you play the flex, and you have the true flex with Yaki. So, or I guess the true projectile, right? And I think that this roster has a very, very, very strong role in DPS. I think a lot of people were kind of questioning why Yaki was going to add to this roster. I think I was for a bit too. But the more I thought about it, the more it made sense, right? One of the biggest problems that Yaki has had in some of his teams in the past is, look back at like the Florida Mayhem days, some of those days. In 2020, when the Mayhem were their best, arguably, Yaki was their best Tracer and their best Genji, and they ran into a Tracer Genji meta. And so they could put him on one or the other. Now I think you allow Yaki to have the role that I think he needs. And I've talked about this in the past. I talked about this with him on New York and on Florida. I think the biggest problem that Yaki has had in both the teams he played on is I think both teams fundamentally built the roster in a wrong way that did not utilize Yaki in the appropriate and proper way. Yaki is not a hyperflex player like Kevster. Kevster can play a lot of different heroes. Yaki cannot. What Yaki is good at, he is exceptional at. He is an incredible Tracer, an incredible Genji, an incredible Echo. He's got a pretty good Reaper too. His Hanzo's like decent. But outside of those five, I wouldn't really pick, and Pharah as well. I don't know if I mentioned Pharah. Outside of those like 5-6 heroes, I would not put Yaki on pretty much anything else. And that was a problem with New York last year when there was no secondary hit scan player. And that was a problem with Florida when it was just basically him and BQB playing together. And so I really like that he is on a roster now that he can actually be the best possible version of himself, where he has the heroes he's really, really good at. And you know if you plug him in on those heroes, you know what you're getting out of him. And I think he will have a really good year alongside Kevster and Kai, where he can play what he's best at. And I think that is where this team is doing a very, very good job. Let's not force Kai and Yaki off of their comfort roles, which I think both Atlanta and Florida and New York did with these players. To me, they're putting all their marbles in the Kevster basket, and they're saying, Yaki and Kai, we just need you to come in and have impact alongside Kevster, and I think it's a really, really, really good team build. So in that way, I love this DPS trio. This is the first team that Yaki has been on that in the Overwatch, you should specify. Runaway is a different story. But this is, in my opinion, is the first team Yaki has been on that has truly used him well and put him in, or in theory, has built around him well. To the point where I think he should have a really, really good year. So I'm very excited by this DPS trio. I think it's one of the best we've ever seen. It's one of my favorites in the league so far, and I'm very, very, very excited to see what they can do and how they go forward with this DPS trio. But let's talk next about the support trio that they have. Funny Astro, Lastro, and Babel. the funny Lastro Babel support line, if you will. I really, really like this support line as well. Funny Astro, we know him. Really, really, really good Brig and Lucio player, especially as Lucio, which is good to see. Really good main support player. Lucio was a really, really important pick last year. I expect him to be another really important pick this year. The benefit this team has, though, is they technically have two people that can play Lucio, because Lastro also plays Lucio and was one of the better flex support players that made the switch to Lucio last year. I'd say he and Violet were the two most successful. I think Violet was the most successful. Lastro was good. They tried to replace him with Lep, and it didn't really work. So clearly, they have faith in Lastro in Houston, and I think he will have another good year here, because I do think he is very, very good. And I think he has a very good kind of team around him now that he's with the Gladiators. And I think this support trio is another very good example of a really well-built trio. I think the Gladiators nailed it with damage, nailed it with support. I think they did a very, very good job. I trust Funny Astro and Lucio and Brig literally every day of the week. I think he is one of the best main support players, just raw main support players in the league. So getting him on this roster, keeping him this year, huge win, huge, huge, huge success for this team. I really love it. I really like to see it. Pairing him with Lastro, who in my opinion is one of the more underrated flex supports in the league. He's not shoe level like they had last year, which is a big loss. So there is a downgrade, but it's not a major downgrade. And they get Babel to be there as their secondary flex support player, which I really like. That if you end up in a double flex support meta, guess what? You have someone in Babel who can play that flex support role. I also don't know how good Lastro is on Kiriko, since he played Lucio for this team for Houston last year during the Kiriko meta, and they had Creative in on Kiriko. So I think that's another good thing about having Babel, is you kind of have a little bit of a safety net in the event that you need someone who's better Kiriko. Babel is a very good Kiriko. That is probably his best flex support hero, is Kiriko. So if you find yourself in a double flex support meta, or you need a hard Kiriko, you know you have someone in Babel who's very, very good, and you have a lot of different potential options for the support line. I would not be surprised if we see all three kind of combinations at some point during the season. If we find ourselves in a hard Lucio Kiriko meta, I definitely could see Funny Astro Babel in. If it's a hard double flex meta, Lastro and Babel. I think a lot of the season will be Funny Astro and Lastro. But we could even see Lastro and Babel in a meta where you kind of have to switch between double flex and Lucio. And so you kind of want Lastro for that flexibility. I really like the support line. I think they play pretty much everything you need. And I like what they have here. I think this is a really good kind of core piece to this roster. The support line is very, very important. We look at Dallas last year. I think a big part of Dallas' success last year was because they just had such an incredible support line. No doubt about it. That was one of their best parts. And so that's a really good thing to see when you have a team like the Gladiators, who, like I said, were very successful last year. Who knows if they'll be able to keep it up exactly this year, but I do love what they have in the support line to kind of be a championship caliber team and a contender at a high level with this roster. And so that brings us to our final player on this roster, in the final role on this roster, which is Dante, the only tank player for the LA Gladiators. Now, if you missed all of the 2022 season, and you're just coming back into the Overwatch League somehow, one, how did you find my videos? Two, yes, this is the same Dante from the Houston Outlaws who played Tracer and Sombra at a very high level, and Doomfist. He's a tank player now. He picked up the role last season, of course, and was honestly very good. He was not, in my opinion, one of the best tank players in the league, but he was very crucial to the Houston Outlaws and their success last year. They got third in the playoffs, and a lot of that was because Dante was very, 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 very quick to kind of pick up the role and fill in and kind of take a good leadership role. And so I do think he should take a pretty big leap this year in kind of his play. He's had a full season and off-season now to grind tank as his main role. He is the only tank player on this roster. They're going to put the resources into him. So I think, in general, Dante should be a better tank player this year than he was last year. Problem is, I think a lot of tanks this year are going to be better than they were last year. I think the overall competition this year is better than it was last year. And I think that Dante is probably the one part on this roster that gives me hesitation. I think Dante's a great player. I don't want this to come across as me bashing Dante and saying he's a bad player. But he is a newer tank player to the role, and I think that it's potentially the part on this roster that could be the easiest to expose this season because he is the only option. There is no real contingency plan in place, right? They are meta-proof in support line. They're meta-proof in the DPS line. I don't know what Dante is going to look like if we get into a hard Winston meta. He was pretty good last year, but now you got Smurf in the West. Fearless and Hanbin are now on separate teams, so that's a problem potentially. You still have you Max and Junbin on San Francisco, so you have a lot of really good main tank players and just tank players in general in this Western region that were not there a year ago. Or that have since kind of moved on and have kind of spread out a little bit more. And I think the tank competition is going to be much more difficult this year than it was last year. And that's really my biggest concern with this team, is Dante. Now, I think that if that's your biggest concern, if Dante is the biggest point for concern on this roster, you have an incredible roster. Because I think this is a very good Gladiators roster. I don't think they're necessarily at the point where he is going to be, or this team, not just Dante, this team as a whole, I don't necessarily think they're going to be competing for stage titles that they were last year. There's not as many tournaments, obviously, so they basically can't be successful this year unless they win both the Midseason Madness and the playoffs, because they're the only two tournaments. But I think this team is going to be one of the better teams in the league. I think they're definitely top 5 contenders at the very least. I think they're in the upper echelon of teams in the Western region. I think there's a lot of competition. It's hard to tell for sure kind of where they fit. But I think as a whole, this is a very well-rounded roster with a very, 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 very solid all-in-all composition. And as much as I kind of think Dante is probably the weakest point in this roster, it doesn't concern me in the same way that a lot of other rosters do, because I think the rest of the roster is so well built that Dante will be enabled to have as much success as possible. I don't think he'll have to carry this team, which I think allows him to have way, way, way more safety, which I think is really, really cool and really, really good. So I'm very excited to kind of see where Dante goes from here and how he kind of grows in a team that I think, honestly, is a better environment for him as a player, which I think is all in all pretty good. So that's something that I think is always good to see, and I'm excited to kind of see where things go from here. But yeah, that's some of my thoughts on the Gladiators. I think they're a really good roster. I think they're going to have a good time this season. I think they're one of my favorite teams going into next year, just in terms of the talent on the roster and all that type of stuff. It's going to be cool to see. But that's all from me. Let me know your thoughts on this Gladiators roster in the comments down below. If you think they look good, not so good, whatever your thoughts are, I'd love to hear from you down below. But that is going to be all from me for today. Thank you all once again for watching. If you want more videos like this in the future, because you enjoyed this one, consider liking and subscribing, as your support does help out a bunch with the channel. But that's going to be all from me for today. Hope you're all staying safe and staying healthy. And until next time, bye-bye.